Hello guys, it is Gate of Theories here, and it has been a few years since the Game of Thrones finale came out. This show was everywhere, you couldn't escape it, and it was incredibly popular, probably the most popular show of the time, until the final episode. Released on 20th of May 2019, the Iron Throne left fans outraged at the show they loved. But upon reflection, was the ending actually that bad, or was it just the media that fueled the fire to make everyone believe it was as if winter had fell? Well, today we're going to be analysing whether the final episode is the worst episode in history, or has it just had bad press, and whether HBO did actually do a decent job at closing this show. Let's get into it. It's fair to say this ending really had a hard job to do. We'd just seen the White Walker dragon break through the Great Wall, and now Season 8 had to deal with fighting the White Walkers and stopping the Night King, Cersei Lannister at the throne getting investments from the bank and joining forces with the Ironborns, and of course Daenerys dealing with Jon Snow also being a Targaryen and having the rightful claim to the throne. Game of Thrones isn't really one for doing things quickly as well. I mean, just think about some of the earlier seasons. We had a whole season watching Brienne take Jaime to King's Landing, and we also had a whole season of watching Arya and the Hound just travelling around Westeros. This show took its time to tell these stories, so cramming all of it into one season really just wasn't the smartest idea, and the first bit of downfall this season has. Especially considering that killing the Night King could have been a full season in itself. I do think this was a main factor as to why this season let down so many people, as it was trying to do so much. It crammed way too much into just 6 episodes that were slightly longer than normal episodes. This was the most popular show on the planet at the time. The sensible thing would have been just to wait a bit longer and film a longer season, or just keep the show going for several seasons, maybe up to season 10, as this show could afford to do that as fans would still be invested. However, HBO wanted to finish this series and use it as a box set that could sell their upcoming streaming service HBO Max, and they didn't really want to wait any longer for that to happen. All they cared about was the money, which in hindsight they probably could have gotten a lot more if they had just waited. This was also combined with the fact that the final book hadn't even been written yet, whereas all previous seasons had been based on books, so show writers were kind of going in blind. It really was just a big mess and a quick cash grab for HBO. But even with all this, I wouldn't say they actually necessarily failed in bringing a satisfying conclusion. People may hate on it now, but maybe that's just because in the moment it was awful, and since then people just haven't had the time to change their mind. But on a rewatch and with some reflection, the ending actually makes more sense than people give it credit for, and it actually ties the story the best it really could have. Yes, I know, having Bran be king at the end does seem like an out of nowhere ending, but what were people really expecting? Having Cersei remain queen, no one would have liked. Having Daenerys win would have been nice but unrealistic, especially since people know Jon is the rightful heir, and in the show it just wouldn't have gone that way. And then having fan favourite Jon Snow win, while it would have gotten fans excited, it would have been the most predictable thing ever. No one guessed Bran would be king, which I guess you could look at as a positive or a negative, but this show thrives on being unpredictable. Just look at how shocked you were the first time you saw the Red Wedding. Having Jon as king would have been the safe way out, and might not have caused the hate the show now gets, but it would have been the easy way out, and that's not what this show is about. At the end of the day, this is the Game of Thrones, and it is a game. But it's a game that's not played fairly in any way whatsoever. Every character who plays with a fair set of dice loses. It's the ones who play with unfair dice that win. Cersei blowing up the religious leaders, Jon Snow coming back to life, and of course the biggest one being Daenerys having 3 literal dragons. However, no character really shows just how unfair the Game of Thrones is apart from Bran, and it makes sense as to why he ends up being on the throne at the end. Let me explain. Bran by the end of the show might not seem like a very important or even likeable character, but we have to remember this show started off with him. All of the events that take place only really happen because of that first episode where the cliffhanger is him being hit out of the window. That is the catalyst that begins Bran's journey and begins the Game of Thrones, because without it, the games could have gone a very different way. This then leads Bran on the journey to find the Three-Eyed Raven after seeing visions of it. While all of these small games of Joffrey being on the throne and Stannis trying to be king instead and Robb Stark trying to win for the North, we see Bran begin to grow and eventually find the Three-Eyed Raven and learn what it's all about. It's the ability to be able to see the past, the present, and the future. And it's when Bran eventually becomes the Three-Eyed Raven when the turning point in the show actually takes place. When the external villains of the White Walkers and the Night King come to be an obstacle to this Game of Thrones, and we get that iconic episode of The Door. There's a reason why that episode has a 9.7 out of 10 on IMDb, because it's just so good. And notice it's here when the true games begin. Cersei realizes she needs to stop Marjorie and become queen, Jon and Sansa take back Winterfell, and Daenerys finally sets sail for Westeros. Almost like the Three-Eyed Raven was the catalyst yet again for these new events. And this carries on for the rest of the show, with Bran and the Three-Eyed Raven slowly beginning to change the course of where the games are heading. It's Bran who helps them defeat the White Walkers by using himself as bait, as he knows Arya will come and save him. It's Bran who confirms that Jon is a secret Targaryen from seeing it in a vision, which kickstarts off the fall of Daenerys and Jon Snow. And it's Bran who confirms to Jaime Lannister that without him being pushed out of that window, none of these events would be playing out the way they're supposed to. And that's why the ending works, because all along this game has been played with unfair dice by all players, but the players have been puppets on a string for the Three-Eyed Raven, who has slowly been making sure everything happens in a certain order that conveniently makes it that the Three-Eyed Raven ends up as king by the end. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, there's no denying that these events have all been pre-planned, with Bran at the end even confirming it to Jon by saying,
"You were exactly where you were supposed to be."
Whether you like Bran or not, personally for me, I much preferred him when he wasn't the Three-Eyed Raven, as I thought in later seasons he's just not that good of a character, and whether you think he's important or not compared to everyone else, at the end of the day, he began the show and he also ended it. Thematically and structurally, this ending does work, even if it isn't exactly the most satisfying conclusion, bringing up questions of whether any characters actually had any choice in what they were doing, or were all of the events always going to happen the way they did, and did the characters even have any free will? Was Daenerys always never going to be queen, and no matter what she did, was her fate always set in stone? So it works thematically and structurally, then why didn't it work for the fans? Well, Game of Thrones unfortunately suffered from what most long shows do, and that's the story develops with the fans. The creator of the show at the beginning most likely did have an ending set in stone for how the games were going to be won, if ever. Now, it's wise to have an endpoint, but it's also good to have an open endpoint that can easily be changed as stories become popular and others don't. This show could have ended either way, but it seems that they purposely stuck with this idea and rolled with it without changing. Because what was the point of the Three-Eyed Raven and Bran's story if he didn't become king at the end? Jon and Sam would have still met the White Walkers regardless, so to make sure it still had some relevance in the storyline, this seems to be the only way. Not to mention, Bran and the Three-Eyed Raven didn't even appear in Season 5, further hyping up its storyline. This show suffered from a How I Met Your Mother, where from the get-go it said that Robin and Ted would be together by the end, but then as the show grew, fans began loving Barney and Robin together. However, the creators didn't adapt their ending for the fans and for the story, and instead kept to their original idea, and it meant that lots of the show's development just didn't work by the end of it. The same applies here. It should have adapted to focus more on Jon, Daenerys and Cersei, instead of taking the cheap way out and putting Bran on the throne. Especially since throughout the whole season he had been going on forever saying that he wasn't going to be king, so it really did just feel like at the time it came out of nowhere. But it's not just Bran's story that technically does have a satisfying conclusion, but just wasn't right for the fans. All of the characters could fit into this, and the same applies where structurally and thematically it works, but doesn't for the fans. The show overall uses a cyclical structure, meaning the ideas that start the show are the same ideas that end the show, and this is the same with most of the characters. Let's take Daenerys for example. We've just came off the back of the Mad King's reign, where the King's Hand had to order someone, being Jaime Lannister, to kill the king as it was getting out of hand. By the time we get to the finale, we've seen Daenerys grow in power and strength, but as soon as she comes to Westeros, she isn't trusted. And gradually her character develops into what the Mad King was, or even worse, by slaughtering the entire city of King's Landing, leading to the Queen's Hand to get someone to kill her before she does something even worse and gets ambitious plans to take over the world. Now this is perfect development for Daenerys and fits perfectly with all of the themes that the show had been using for her character. And it was clear that this ending of Jon killing her and Daenerys going psycho was pre-planned, as all the way back in season 2, Daenerys has a vision of the future where she enters the throne room but sees it's full of what viewers back then thought was snow, but of course we now know it's ash, and with the room and building being half destroyed. Again, hinting that this outrageous ending was planned from the beginning. And what also fits up thematically is Drogon burning the throne, since the game started because the Mad King was destroyed, and it ends when this next Mad Queen has been killed. So whether you like it or not, thematically and structurally, it does work. Let's go to the Lannisters next, and these were given the worst ending in my opinion, but yet again, their endings do make sense and fit with all of the development they've gone through. Cersei wasn't given justice in season 8, and this is the one thing I'd say that HBO definitely got wrong in season 8. They just made Cersei this villain and then let her be defeated so easily by Daenerys. Now, to be fair, Daenerys did have a dragon and a huge army, but Cersei just kind of gives up, which really doesn't fit her character, who in previous seasons would do anything to remain in power. But even after that small annoyance, her ending where she and Jaime reunite and die together, both realizing that what they wanted all along wasn't power but each other, does still fit with this cyclical structure. Starting with Jaime and Cersei being together and pushing Bran out, to them being together at the end when they're crushed. Tyrion probably goes on the biggest journey out of all the characters, but his ending also still makes sense. His whole story arc is about proving him being a dwarf doesn't mean that he can't be a good and respected Lannister. And it works because at the beginning we had a fat drunken king who had no respect for anyone with a council full of old men, to by the end we have a disabled and paralyzed king with a dwarf as a hand to the king, a woman guarding and being on the council, and the rest of the people being people in society who everyone has rejected, like Sam. That was probably the Three-Eyed Raven's plan, to stop the traditional way of who was on the throne and hinting at the first few signs of democracy by electing your king or queen later on. But finally, let's move on to the Starks, who are the main family in the show, and their ending fits up the most thematically and structurally. We've already discussed Bran, but we go from the beginning of the show with the Starks all being separated, and the whole show is the journey of them coming back together, but by the end, their true fate was to be apart, and it might not end with Jon Snow being king, but it does end with all of the Starks being in power. King of Westeros, King of the North, leader of the Night's Watch, all going out and finding the rest of the world. It fits and is a solid ending, especially when at the end we see Jon Snow going out into the same woods where that first scene of Game of Thrones took place, and how it's the beginning of spring now, and that the Great Winter has now passed. Jon taking the throne was never his intention, so this ending, while sad, still works. And these easily set up for all the spin-offs that could have happened if this ending was better received. And like I say, this ending works for a whole array of other characters as well, such as Grey Worm and the Hound. But that's the problem with this ending. It should have worked, but it just doesn't. And all of these storylines wrapped up in a satisfying way that made logical sense. The entire season was an Avengers level event with all of these characters coming together, which also should have worked. Even the episodes should have worked, with many basically being copies of previous ones but on a much bigger scale. The Long Night, which is the battle against the White Walkers, is basically the same as every other previous episode-long battle against the White Walkers, but just with nearly all of the main characters fighting together, like the portal scene in Endgame, so it should deserve way more than just a 7.4 on IMDb. The Bells, where Daenerys burns the city of King's Landing, only has a 5.9 on IMDb, and yet that is basically showing what the Mad King was like, which has been hinted at throughout the entire show, and was basically a repeat of the Battle of King's Landing in Season 2, but with dragons and on a much bigger scale. But that still is rated very low. And like we've discussed, the last episode should have worked. Yeah, it only has a 4 out of 10 on IMDb and has ruined the reputation of this show forever. And I think the main reason for this is purely because of the media. The last season had 2 years of waiting, and during that time, it built up so much hype. It was so huge that it meant that some of the final episodes were played in cinemas. It was that big. However, too much hype can sometimes be bad, as fans and the media come up with ideas of how they think this show should end, and unfortunately, this show didn't adapt to that, and instead stuck to its main ending that clearly it had been planning for a while. It's what lots of films and shows during the pandemic have suffered with as well. Look at Black Widow, for example. It had 2 years of hype because of the pandemic, which really didn't help its case, and therefore people ended up being disappointed of what happened because they'd hyped up something bigger than what it was actually going to be. Not to mention, this show was starting from 2011 and ended in 2019, and this is before streaming was mainline everywhere, so many people won't have seen the early seasons for several years and forgotten key points, since you would have had to buy the show to see it again, which also didn't help the long-awaited hype. I'm not saying I necessarily like Brandon Stark being the winner of Game of Thrones, but it should work. Unfortunately, the media, the hype, and HBO not waiting enough time for more seasons ruined this ending and therefore ruined all of Season 8, which is why epic Avengers level events are now looked down on, which is honestly a real shame. But now in hindsight, people can reflect on it, and I honestly do recommend going back and watching it again, and you'll see with a rewatch that the ending and that last season aren't as bad as the media tells you, and at the end of the day, it does all still make sense, even if it's not necessarily what the fans wanted. But anyway guys, that's the end of this long video essay. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have, make sure that you smash that like button down below and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Guys, let us know down below in the comments, do you agree with me? Do you think that actually in hindsight, this ending to Game of Thrones does fit up structurally and thematically and is a satisfying enough conclusion, but unfortunately because of the hype, because of the media and because of everything else, it now has a really bad reputation and is going to be looked down on forever. Let me know all your thoughts down below, and as always, we've been here on Gate of Theories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.